Hey, thanks for tuning into my talk. This is Houston, we have a problem. It's a bit weird doing things this way, but I guess this is going to be the new normal now. So the title of my talk is Houston, we have a problem. I'm here today to talk to you about Europe's proposals for future intelligent roadways to support connected and autonomous vehicles. So, overview of what I'm going to talk about in this session. First up, who am I and where did this project come from? Then a large portion of this talk is going to be discussing the proposed CAV ecosystem. There's a lot of proposed components in these future systems, so you need to kind of know what all the components are before you can understand the overarching system. I'm also going to be shit-talking them as I go. From here, I'm going to be discussing some of the threats likely to be faced by the ecosystems. So who's likely to target them, with what resources, and what kind of things they're going to be going after. I'll talk through some example scenarios of how an attacker might infiltrate the network and what to expect. Next up, I'll provide considerations for how we can improve the situation. And finally, the conclusions, which, spoiler alert, is mainly that everything is nightmare. Then we'll have some acknowledgements and time for questions, which I believe is going to be all typed. So a little about me. My name's Vic Harkness. I've got a degree in robotics and artificial intelligence and a degree in cybersecurity. I also worked as a falconer for a bit. After graduating, I worked for DSTL, which is a bit of the UK Ministry of Defence, then moved to MWR Info Security. That got purchased by F-Secure, so now I work at F-Secure. And I was the lead author on the bit of work that this talk is discussing. If you want to talk to me, you can find me on Twitter at Vic Harkness. Talk to me about falconry, facial recognition systems, biometrics, and network vehicle security. So an overview of the project. This package of work was done as part of the Zenzik Cyber Feasibility Report project. So the Zenzik Cyber Feasibility Report project aims to inform and advise the UK government on the security of future CAV and ITS networks. So I know I've said CAV a few times already. I'm going to expand on it now. CAV means connected and autonomous vehicles. ITS, however, means intelligent transport systems. They're basically the same thing. They're referring to the same general concept, but some people prefer to say CAV, some prefer to say ITS. I think they're more commonly called ITS, and within the standards documents, they're called ITS. But Zenzik prefers to call them CAV, so throughout this talk, I'll largely be calling them CAV. So as I'm sure you're aware, automated vehicles are becoming a thing. In the future, it's envisioned that most people will drive either hyper-connected vehicles or have an automated vehicle. To support this future, the creation of sensor-rich intelligent roadways has been proposed. The UK government wants to buy into this future. They don't necessarily want to be the first people to create these intelligent roadway systems, but they want to be the best to do it. They want the most robust roadways and they want them to be the most secure. And the Zenzik Cyber Feasibility Report feeds into this goal. So 7 companies worked on the problem space, and Zenzik created a summary report. This summary report went off to government to help them decide what they should do about future roadways. So my team at F-Secure looked at the V2X, or vehicle to everything aspect of the problem, as well as considering how you might test these future networks at scale. But to understand the problem, we needed to look at the space as a whole. So our paper provides an overview of the entire space, as well as making recommendations on testing at scale. There should be a link to the white paper available by the time you're watching this. At the time of recording, it's not gone live yet, but I'm sure we can share it in the chat or something like that. As a quick note, the proposals we looked at for future CAV infrastructure have been provided by the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, the International Organization for Standardization, and the European Commission. So it's a fairly Europe-centric presentation, I'm afraid. But there are very similar proposals in the US, and there's kind of a lot of equivalency between the proposals. So hopefully it's still useful for non-European people. But hopefully this talk and our white paper provide sufficient information for someone wishing to enter the problem space to get up to speed on the future proposals. So first we're going to talk about the CAV ecosystem components. Whilst our area of the project was dealing with the vehicles to everywhere communications, I still consider the internal systems of a vehicle as an important part of the CAV ecosystem. Vehicles are no longer expected to be used solely as a means of transportation. They guide us to our destinations using maps. They advise us on the best route to take using traffic information. They entertain us using audio and video. In the future, they will ease the burden of driving altogether by being able to autonomously navigate to our destinations. To facilitate this, vehicles contain complex internal networks. Future vehicles are more akin to computer networks. Lots of smaller computers all working on smaller parts of the task networked together. So for instance, you could have one computer that's driving the infotainment system, another one that's driving the lights, but they all need to be connected so that the infotainment system can be used to control the lights, for instance. These future vehicles will be handling large amounts of data taken from a range of sources. Some of those are going to be external, like GPS data, traffic data, data coming in from the vendor, whoever you bought the car off. There's also internal data sources within the vehicle. So you've got your classic integrated sensors, like your speed sensors, your tire pressure sensor. But the more futuristic systems are going to have like cameras, range sensors like sonars to detect where there's nearby vehicles or detect if someone's walked in front of the car. And you'll also be taking inputs from the driver of the car, like steering wheel, pressing brakes, that sort of thing. Some of the proposals we looked at also expected some more novel sensors to be used. So one of the proposals actually described a system whereby the car can automatically monitor the biometrics of the user. And so if the driver of the car was to, for instance, have a heart attack, the system would be able to automatically detect and communicate this and assumedly call an ambulance. But with all this data coming from a wide range of sources, how can you trust it? It's a given that attackers are going to be targeting the internal vehicle networks. I'm not going to talk specifically about data hygiene within internal vehicle networks, because I'm sure there'll be someone else at the Car Hacking Village who knows a lot more about it than me and will be able to do a much better job than me of explaining it. But in general, I will say, handle the data with care. No component should place absolute trust in the data it receives. But really, it's up to you guys making these systems to decide how trustworthy components are and design your models based around that trust. Some of the sort of things that an attacker is likely to target are the vehicle sensors. They make a good potential entry point for introducing false or malicious data into the vehicle network. And I mean, people are already playing around with the future systems. Like, people have been using adversarial examples to generate stickers they can put on road signs, which will cause the car to no longer classify the road sign correctly. So what was once a stop sign is now a speed limit sign, and the car just drives straight through. Another thing the attackers might target are the entertainment and infotainment systems. They're another good route for introducing malicious data into or gaining access into connected vehicles. I mean, we're already getting familiar with the advanced infotainment systems. We're used to them having a touch screen now to display maps, to play with our music, all that sort of thing. In some of the CAV proposed documents, these systems are also going to be doing tourist information for you. You're going to drive past a mountain and the car's going to start telling you what the mountain is, the history of it, all about it, for better or worse. Potentially they're kind of similar to sensors, in that attackers might try and manipulate behavior by inserting malicious data such as incorrect traffic data, or try and use them as a point from which they could pivot to elsewhere within the car's internal network. The third thing I wanted to mention is applications, because you've got to have apps if you want to be futuristic with your system. So in the envisioned future connected and autonomous vehicles, you'll be able to download apps from an app store, like how you would on your phone. And we all know how good that is for device security. There's little information so far on how these will actually look in terms of security and access permission models. Don't know if it's going to be like the Apple Store, where you've got to have your app pre-approved before it can be uploaded, or if it's going to be a bit more like the Android Store, where you can just kind of go for it. There's no advice on this at this point. But it does seem like they're going to be an excellent route to break into a vehicle's internal network. I mean, they might end up being used as part of a jailbreaking solution for the vehicles. So with Teslas, it turns out that when you buy an upgrade for a Tesla, it can be remotely enabled. You don't actually need to go to the garage to get it upgraded. So when they had the massive fires in California a few years back, Tesla remotely pushed free battery updates to cars within the area of effect so that they could escape easier, or the drivers could escape easier. But the Lord Elon giveth and the Lord Elon taketh away. There's been lots of cases of people buying second-hand Tesla models with certain upgrades enabled, only to have them be remotely disabled again after purchase. Perhaps applications will be used for this sort of functionality in future CAVs. Certainly seems like a fun area for future investigation, if nothing else. So what if someone manages to compromise multiple aspects of a vehicle's internal network at once? The vehicles ideally should be able to detect this and handle it in some way. because it's not really the best solution if it just crashes into a wall because it thinks it's the road, Wile E. Coyote style. Perhaps it'd be more appropriate for a vehicle that detects anything funky going on to drive to the side of the road and refuse to move again until it gets assistance. Or is that just going to be a perfect vector for denial of service attacks? Going to be really annoying and not answer that. Instead, I'll move on to talking about personal stations. So the ETSI standards propose the use of personal stations. These are little handheld devices which are designed to be connected to the overarching CAV networks. The exact purpose of them is unclear, but they seem to basically be mobile phones, like you can install apps on them. It's suggested they're used by low-speed users of networks such as pedestrians and cyclists. I've got a few of the suggestions on the slides, like using them to check bus times, use them to update bus times, use them to look at maps. They're basically mobile phones. Maybe this will just morph into an app that you can put on your own mobile phone so you don't have to carry something extra around, who knows? As far as security goes, I'd say treat them like mobile phones. They're likely to be an easy target for theft because they're quite small, so you want them to be lockable and remotely trackable. You also, again, don't want to be completely trusting of data coming from them because there's a high risk of compromise if they are akin to mobile phones. So the envisioned future intelligent roadways will need lots and lots of supporting infrastructure. Infrastructure to support the connections between connected vehicles, infrastructure to support the automated decision-making capabilities of automated vehicles. But not all vehicles will be connected or automated in the future. You're still going to get the people like me who are scared of new technology and want something more old-fashioned. Unfortunately, you can't quite ignore us weirdos who refuse to join the Borg. You still need to know where the old-fashioned vehicles are so that they can be incorporated into your traffic models or avoided by your automated systems. Oh gosh, it's gone, sorry. Extensions of current CCTV and radar system capabilities, when augmented by additional sensors, could be sufficient to track old-fashioned vehicles as though they were connected vehicles. In addition to tracking vehicles, sensors can be used to provide supplementary data into decision-making systems. For example, local weather information or information on road conditions could be useful to augment the data already within the systems. It's also quite useful for automated systems. So if you've got a human driver, they might, notice that it's raining and the road is wet and so automatically slow down. Whereas an automated system, it doesn't work quite like the human does. But if it was receiving data saying the road's wet, slow down, then it will be able to act on that. So thanks to these prolific sensors, it might be the case that these automated systems will be able to behave in a more human-like manner. But unfortunately, just covering everything with sensors means you've got more things to secure. So just go search for CCTV on Showdown if you're bored. You can view the CCTV feeds, which isn't that bad. You'd just be watching cars go along the road, not really that worrisome. But some of these cameras are designed to be remotely administered. You get that traditional admin credentials combo going, and suddenly you have access to a node within the CAV network. If the network trusts data coming from that CCTV system to a high degree, then the whole network's going to be having a bad time. So just, if you're going to be making sensors that are likely to end up in CAV networks, please secure them. Don't have easily guessable default creds. Require admins to use VPNs to remotely administer them. Just do something, please. It seems like it's going to be a really easy way for attackers to get into the networks. Next up, we've got roadside units. So these roadside units, or RSUs, are designed to collect, collate, and forward data from other bits of the network. They'll be taking the data from pretty much everything in the network. They can collect data from roadside sensors and vehicles, and they'll send this data onwards to data hubs, which are processing centers designed to inform traffic control decisions. The RSUs can also take data from vendors and transmit it back down to the vehicles. RSUs are actually physical units proposed to be positioned every 500 meters along the side of the intelligent roadway. They'll all be connected up in some manner. Some believe that RSUs should be able to take more active roles within the network, such as directly controlling autonomous vehicles. I think that's kind of a bad idea for reasons that should become even more clear as this talk goes on. The RSUs are envisioned to contain some heavy-duty networking equipment, including industrial network switches and ITS station border routers. You want the industrial network switches to be survivable in the harsh environments of constant outdoor usage. And they also support standard security features such as MAC address filtering, remote management, network access, etc. During this study, we read a report that was investigating the security at one of these proposed roadside units. And they found that, yeah, the switch in it had MAC address filtering in place, but the MAC address of the computer driving the RSU was written on the side of the box, so not really the best security, maybe. The ITS station border routers within the RSUs are designed as the point through which data from the intelligent roadways is sent off to the data hubs. There's a few proposals of what form this transport medium could take. Some suggest using LTE. Others suggest that you could just lease actual physical lines from local councils. There's lots of different approaches, and with different approaches come different security concerns. But when you're securing these RSUs, you should take a general network infrastructure security approach. So consider the physical security. Make the locks on the physical box secure with a tamper detection system. If the RSU is hidden away behind the trees, monitor them with the CCTV systems. So in the report where they noticed the MAC address was written on the side of the box, the guy who did that study, he actually set up a tent next to the RSU, and he camped out there for like 2 days and no one noticed him messing around with the thing. So you need some kind of monitoring, because 2 days gives you quite a bit of time to play around with stuff. Make sure that tamper detections are actually followed up upon. So you could cross-reference things like timings of tamper detections with maintenance schedules. And if the tamper is determined to not be a false alarm, you should take action. For instance, you could consider that all data from that node is now unsafe, and so do not make any important decisions based upon it. In addition to physical security, you should also follow good network security best practices. Change default creds, disable unused services, all that good stuff. Make sure that a procedure for patching devices is in place, encrypt the data being held locally, and when it's being transmitted onwards, especially if you're making use of third-party transmission mediums. Tangentially, you should consider the security of device maintenance systems. It's likely that there'll be engineers coming to, do upgrades on these systems or do general maintenance tasks or whatever, really. The engineers carrying out the legitimate work upon the RSUs will probably have laptops that they're designed to plug into the system. They might also have been on a dodgy porn website in the hotel the night before and be bringing all sorts of nasties with them. So again, just don't trust things. Don't trust an engineer's laptop, even though in theory it should be fine, it might not be. Trust no one, not even yourself. I know I sound like a broken record, but do not place absolute trust in any single aspect of the system. So data hubs are where all the data lives. The data collected by the RSUs will end up here. The scales of the data hubs is kind of unclear right now. I mean, maybe they're going to be regional, maybe they'll be countrywide, maybe they'll be just for a town or a specific section of road. It's not really clear. It's also not clear who's going to run the data hubs or what exactly they'll be doing with the data. But generally, they're probably going to be used in traffic management systems, traffic analysis, all that good stuff. There's also proposals for their usage in test beds. I'll be talking a bit more about the test beds later, but the basic idea is that there'll be regions of roadways which are designated for vendors to test their new kit on. Because of this, there's going to be large amounts of data being collected on the test bed roadways, which vendors can then evaluate like post-trial to work out the performance of their systems. And that will make testbed data hubs a really high-value target for attackers, because there's going to be lots and lots of data, and because people are going to be testing new models of vehicles, it's likely to be about things that aren't actually available yet. So it would be great for corporate espionage. Or, I mean, what if you could just get into the data hub and delete all the data in it? Could you force a vendor to have to redo trials and actually delay the release of a new product? Security of the data hubs is going to be incredibly important, and it's likely going to be fairly bespoke. I mean, one could probably learn from security best practices for any large-scale sensitive data holder, but I mean, just once again, you don't want to trust all the data you're receiving into these data hubs, just in general. Don't let little bobby tables ruin your day. Likewise, you need some form of accountability within the system. If you find that you're frequently getting malicious data from a certain node, like you're frequently getting bobby tables popping up, you want to be able to identify what node this malicious data is coming from so that you can actually address it. Or just if you're getting like invalid data coming from a node, you want to be able to work out where it's coming from and address whatever the issue is. So transmission medium. There's the potential for lots of different data transmission media to be used within these future networks. I'll be talking about the connection issues within the next section when I discuss the bespoke protocols that have been proposed. So LTE is like the most obvious connectivity choice. It's simple, it's fairly accessible nowadays, it's reasonably cheap. Some vehicles already make use of LTE. You've got systems such as eCall, which automatically calls the emergency services if it detects you're in a crash. And LTE can also be used to transmit over-the-air software to vehicles, software updates, to vehicles. I mean, in future CAV vehicles, LTE will probably be used by applications and maybe also by some of the roadside sensors, who knows? Standard LTE security best practices should be followed. Just make sure it's not too obvious that your tech is using 5G LTE so it doesn't get blamed for international pandemics. As mentioned earlier, it's been proposed that lease lines could be used to transmit data from RSUs back to data hubs. If you're sending potentially sensitive data over third-party lines, you probably want to try and encrypt it and sign it so that it cannot be read or tampered whilst it's in transit. From what I can tell, lease lines will be used only for data hub communications, though. They're not going to be used for like sending data from one car to another, because that just wouldn't make sense. Finally, we get to the wireless local area networks. Small WLANs within vehicles are proposed, which allow users to get onto the internet via their vehicle. However, it's also been proposed that giant WLANs could be used to handle the majority of communications between CAV network nodes. To me, this proposed usage of wireless local area networks for data transmission between CAV nodes is super interesting. It's proposed that it will be enabled through the usage of a relatively new 802.11p standard OCB mode. And as always with this talk, I'll be talking more about that later. So now that you know about the transmission medium, what about the transmission protocols? Within CAV networks, there's two main types of message being sent between vehicles and other nodes, CAM and DENIM. CAM standing for Cooperative Awareness Messages, and DENIM being Decentralized Environmental Notification Messages. For those of you in the US, these are equivalent to DSRC Basic Safety Messages, where BSM Part 1 is about equivalent to CAM, and Part 2 is about equivalent to DENIM. So, about CAM. As the name suggests, CAM are used for cooperative awareness. They're what let the vehicles know where each other are, so that they can move cooperatively. The CAM acts as a heartbeat for the vehicle, providing metrics on its current state. So this includes things like the current time, the location, heading direction, speed, if the lights are on or not, all that sort of thing. The vehicles don't send these to anyone in particular, they just transmit it out into the world for anyone or anything to pick up. They're signed by the pseudonym certificates used within the CAV ecosystem, and I'll talk more about certificates later. The generation of CAM is controlled by the Cooperative Awareness Basic Service within the vehicle. The CA Basic Service also receives and processes CAM from other vehicles. DENIM, on the other hand, are used by vehicles to share an awareness of any events that may have occurred. An event could be that an accident has occurred ahead, or that the vehicle has detected the presence of ice on the road, that sort of thing. Interestingly, the DENIM standards also contains medical emergency flags. These are the things I spoke about earlier, whereby if the vehicle detects that the driver's had a heart attack or they're in a diabetic coma, it's got a specific DENIM message type to let the other cars around that driver know that that's what happened. So once a vehicle's detected an event, it creates a new event DENIM. This contains info on what the event type is, the geographic area of relevance for the event, and that includes details of what roads will lead up to encountering the event. This DENIM is transmitted out into the world where it's picked up by the DEN basic service of other vehicle nodes. When a vehicle picks up a DENIM, the onus is placed upon the receiving vehicle to decide the relevance of the message. So the vehicle will determine if it's within the geographic area of relevance for the event, or if it's even heading in the correct direction to encounter the event. If it is, the vehicle will update its internal records and automatically retransmits the DENIM onwards to other vehicles. If it's not relevant, it just ignores it. Based on this automatic forwarding, vehicles may be updated as to the existence of an event as soon as they enter the relevant area. Likewise, if the initially reporting vehicle leaves the area, the event is not forgotten. And vehicles might also provide updates to an existing event, even if they were not the first vehicle to report it. Likewise, vehicles may send a negation DENIM to report that an event has ended. As I said before, both CAM and DENIM are signed. The proposed certificate system in CAV is a little bit bonkers in my mind, and I'll describe it later. But the key point here is that messages are signed. They're not encrypted because CAVs don't join networks in the traditional sense. Because there's no network joining, it's all up to the CA and DEN basic services to verify the validity of all received messages. This could be problematic for a lot of reasons. It seems like it's going to be really easy to jam a given vehicle by just spamming out messages near it. Likewise, if an attacker could fuzz the basic service and find a message that would crash it, then there's little resiliency against potentially harmful messages within this environment. I mean, it wouldn't even matter if the vehicle was part of the network, because it's up to the receiver to determine if the message is valid or not, if it's from an actual member of the network or from an actual vehicle, sorry. There's also no nonce values in CAM and denim, so you've got your standard risks of replay attacks there. In these future networks, some of the information contained within CAM will be used within the intelligent roadway systems for deciding things like traffic flow. So say you're an ambulance, the traffic light behavior might automatically be updated to favor traffic coming from your direction. So why not just continually replay a packet capture of an ambulance? The closest thing to nonce values that's included already is timestamps. And these, in my mind, are kind of weirdly done as well. Epochs weren't good enough for these guys. What they've gone for is a system whereby the time from the start of 2004 is taken in milliseconds, and then it's divided by 2 to the power of 16, or 65,536, which is coincidentally a touch over the number of milliseconds in a minute. The remainder is then untransmitted. So whilst you could kind of use this in your application as a nonce value, you'd have something that could be replayed roughly every minute or so, depending on your tolerances. But yeah, this slightly weird timeliness metric makes it very hard to discern the liveliness of messages at a glance. So go ahead with those replay attacks. Another issue stems from the automatic forwarding of denim if the receiving vehicle is within the area of relevance. Like I mentioned, denim describe an event. Vehicles can automatically retransmit received denim. So now something interesting about these CAV networks is that a mechanism is proposed to exist for detecting and punishing malicious behavior. The details of it aren't really specified in any great detail, but the general gist of it is that nodes can automatically report that a certain vehicle is sending out malicious data, with the vehicle being identified by its signing certificate. It's unclear how many reports are needed to trigger a ban in the network, but yeah, after a certain threshold of reports are hit, a vehicle certificate will be temporarily rescinded. This means that other messages won't see its nodes as valid. This means that other nodes won't see its messages as valid, and so will disregard them. So now, when a vehicle automatically forwards on a denim, it repackages the message. The sender ID that you received of the initial message is then replaced with the sender ID of the vehicle that's forwarding on the message. And it's re-signed using the resender's certificate. And I mean, can you see where I'm going with this? Say the threshold of reports was 5. If you could have 5 vehicle nodes that you control send out denim containing malicious data near a target, it in theory would just repeat them all on. That vehicle would hit the ban threshold quite easily and would be banned from the network. Suddenly it's denied access to the CAV network. Generally, I think that mechanisms such as automatic bans need to be carefully considered, because there's a real potential for abuse in there. So how do we transmit these CAM and denim? Ad hoc networking is required for the CAV networks because of the node's tendency to move around quite a bit at high speeds. The idea of having passing vehicles connect to RSUs as they go past has been floated, but it was written off because there wouldn't be sufficient time, apparently. I'm not sure how fast people think future cars are going to go, but... So I must apologize, it's now time for acronym o'clock. I'll try and make this as clear as possible, but if you're confused at all, just ask me questions afterwards and hopefully I can explain it a bit better. So to create these ad hoc networks, the usage of 802.11p standard in OCB mode is proposed. So what's an 802.11p OCB? 802.11 is an IEEE standard for network access control. It provides the authentication mechanisms for devices wishing to join a LAN or WLAN, as well as allowing for things like network decongestion to automatically take place. It's the stuff your home Wi-Fi network probably uses. So on top of the initial standard sits 802.11p, which has been specifically designed for vehicle networks. It's licensed for use in the US's WAVE systems and in Europe's ITS-G5 communication networks. It's been allocated the frequency band of 5.9 gigahertz. It's all fairly standard so far, but we need to have ad hoc networks. My home Wi-Fi isn't ad hoc. I need to connect devices to it. How does this work with these cars? So in this case, the 802.11p is being used in OCB mode, which means outside context of BSS, or basic service set. Basic service set refers to the collection of things which can communicate with each other within an 802.11 network. When you join things to your home Wi-Fi network, they become part of the BSS. And then messages sent within the network are tagged with a BSS ID, or basic service set ID, which marks them as belonging to the WLAN, so that all the nodes know if they're actually coming from something within the network and should be, this is something they should bother with or not. In 802.11p OCB mode, we don't want any of that. We want everything to be able to transmit to everything else with no need to join the network. This allows for the truly ad hoc networking, which is required for CAM and denim to just be spat out and have everyone listen to them. No authentication is required to be able to transmit within these new networks. So it's up to the receiver to investigate the signing certificate and assess if the messages are valid or not. But also, because there's no joining to a network, there's no inbuilt decongestion, apart from some basic polling and automatic rate adjustment. Can you see where that might lead to some problems? If you said denial of service, you'd be right. What we've got here is the frequency allocations for ITSG5. The EU has provided permissions for ITSG5 transmissions within the 5.47 to 5.925 gigahertz range. It's a nice big, you see that nice big band on the left of the diagram? That's for broadband radio access networks, radio local area networks, and wireless local area networks. And the key point for this is that you need to make use of dynamic frequency selection to avoid co-channel interference if you want to transmit in that range, which, since our CAV's networks aren't going to be connecting to the WLAN in the traditional sense, they cannot. So basically, you've already limited yourself from using a large chunk of the band you've got available to you. Next up, you've got your little DSRC band in the middle. Well, that's not for ITSG5, so we can't use that. On the far right, we've already got a little band, 5.905 to 5.925 gigahertz, that's reserved for future use. So basically, the CAV networks are only left with 5.88 to 5.905 gigahertz ranges. And I hear there's a lot of cars in general, like there's a lot of them. They tend to all get together on these big stretches, and there's just a lot of them all talking at once. So, and then there's going to be like a shit ton of sensors on top of that too. It doesn't seem like it's going to go well, really. So the proposed ad hoc networks in CAV networks are pretty unique because it removes the issues from everything having to be joined to the network. And there's a certificate infrastructure in place, so you can still verify the validity and integrity of received messages at least. But that's the problem. When people aren't having to join a network, it means anyone can transmit. You've got to process every single message you receive to work out if it's valid or not. I think that in these future CAV networks, denial of service attacks are going to be a real big issue, both on the frequency jamming front, but also from inducing the vehicles to process large quantities of junk messages. Or does it even have to be junk, really? With the automatic forwarding of denim, you wouldn't need to have many cars in an area to get a good packet storm going. If we decide to go with the scenario whereby roadside units can be used to teleoperate autonomous vehicles, it's going to go kind of badly. It just does not seem like a good idea. Ideally, no vehicle should need to be connected to the CAV networks to operate. Whilst being joined would increase the efficiency of operations, each vehicle should be capable of operating without receiving any data from external sources. So now I'm going to finally talk about the proposed usage of public key infrastructure and vehicle certificates. The European Commission has proposed an entire public key infrastructure, or PKI, for the CAV networks. In their proposals, they're keen to stress that it's just a proposal, not gospel. But honestly, it's fairly standard stuff really in the proposal. At the top, you've got your root certificate authority, and the proposals describe in great detail how to physically secure these. There's fairly standard encryption schemes. They're making use of AES 128. I'm not going to go into too much details on the PKI since it's all fairly standard from what I could tell. Excuse me. The vendors will have their own certs, which they'll use to sign vehicle certs before the vehicle is sold. These preloaded certs are known as enrollment credentials. Once a vehicle is sold now on the road, it uses its enrollment credentials to request access tokens, which are also known as pseudonyms. And this request goes via the roadside units and the the pseudonyms are returned via the roadside units. So pseudonyms are where things get really weird in my mind. The creator of the CAV networks heard that privacy is a good thing, and they want to maintain it within these networks, which, so far so good, it's a good idea. They then decided that it would be bad for vehicles to transmit a unique identifier, because then someone could track them. I think they forgot that license plates are a thing, but let's put that aside for now. When a vehicle uses its enrollment credentials to request pseudonyms, it's given a pool of 100 of them. These are valid for a period of 1 week. The pseudonyms are used to sign all the CAM and denim that the vehicle sends out so that they can be verified. Pseudonyms are designed to be rapidly changing. On the slides, I've got the recommendations that come from the European Commission on when you should cycle pseudonym. And they're kind of weird. So when you start the car, you cycle to a new pseudonym. You change again after driving in the region of 800 to 1500 meters. Then again, somewhere after 2 to 6 meters, then again after 15 kilometers. And it's just so arbitrary. Like, why are we switching between distance and time? Like, it's weird. But potentially you could be cycling through quite a lot of them on one road trip. And you've got a pool of 100 pseudonyms to use, right? And that's got to last you a week. There's a bit of disparity on what happens when you run out. According to Etsy, you should request a new pool of 100 once you run out. The European Commission, however, states that you can just reuse your pool of 100 so long as they're still within the validity period. But not everyone is always in range of the infrastructure needed to get more pseudonyms. Because of this, it's possible for vehicles to be preloaded with up to 3 months worth of future dated pseudonyms. I mean, what are the practicalities of pseudonym cycling? When a vehicle cycles to its next pseudonym, it also needs to update its IP address. Otherwise, you could trivially track the vehicle through these changes. The standards documentation recommends the usage of stateless address auto-configuration as described in RFC 4862. So RFC 4862 provides a framework for devices in a network to automatically configure themselves using a mixture of information being advertised by a router and from locally available information. This allows the nodes to communicate directly between each other without needing to go through a router, which is appropriate here. CAVs are intended to use IPv6 addresses. As this address space is quite large, there's a low risk of collision in the pseudo-randomly generated IPv6 addresses created using RFC 4862. But to avoid collision, RFC 4862 nodes do advertise their proposed new IPv6 addresses and give neighbors the chance to respond if they've already claimed them. So what's to stop an attacker from using this to track a vehicle's IP address changes? I mean, not much really, so long as you were keeping near the vehicle. Or just look at the MAC address, as these are not cycled at the same time as the IP addresses. Or more interestingly, what if you always claimed that you were already using the IPv6 address that it's advertising? Like, could you just make a little box that you can tape onto the vehicle, a little address denial box, which automatically lays claim to any address being advertised by the vehicle? Again, I think that just denial of service attacks are going to be a big thing in these future CAV networks. In my mind, pseudonym cycling seems more likely to enable abuse than to protect privacy. As I mentioned before, there are provisions for vehicles to be automatically banned from the CAV network via their certificate being revoked. The certificates being revoked would potentially just be their pseudonym. So the attacker could either induce a pseudonym cycle via normal driving or potentially manipulate their system into cycling on demand. It's an ideal method of ban evasion, really. To combat this, it's been suggested that hardware-trusted components could be used to provide more robust banning mechanisms. This could be used to wipe the entire pool being stored on the vehicle. But then you've still got the problems I talked about earlier, whereby you can just cause a vehicle to be unjustly banned from the network. Also, I'm kind of always wary of placing too much trust in anything that's sold as unhackable. It just seems like a bad idea, you're asking for trouble, you're painting your bullseye on it. And there's nothing to say that an attacker would need to control multiple vehicles even to be able to gain malicious levels of influence within the CAV networks. I mean, Tesla's already had issues with all parts of head units appearing on eBay unwiped. It's likely that whatever contains the CA/DEN basic service will appear soon enough, harvested from written off cars by unscrupulous garages. Just pick up a couple of these and you're good to go with your Sybil attacks. They might come preloaded with 3 months of certs, or maybe they'll still be able to gain new certs from the network. It might not be the case that the vendor knows the car was written off, so its enrollment credentials were not revoked. Use these to your heart's content to avoid bans, induce bans in others, flood networks with malicious data, whatever you feel like, really. Or you could use these to send out your CA/DEN basic service crashing messages that you've developed previously by fuzzing the basic services. Or if you could gain access to multiple pseudonyms at once, use them to simulate other vehicles. You got someone tailgating you, start sending out spoofed cans signed with one of your other pseudonyms, simulating a vehicle following behind you. The tailgater's car might think there's a car in that space already and automatically fall back. The final major component of the CAV ecosystem that I want to talk about is test beds. These are regions of roadway which vendors can test their new products on. They can include a mixture of private roads and public roads, and they will be absolutely covered in sensors so that the vendors can receive their high quality trials data. In current proposals, vendors will be able to buy access to In current proposals, vendors will be able to buy access to data from specific regions of test beds at specific times. It's been suggested that this could be facilitated using a web interface, which comes with its own issues, really. I mean, generally, the security of these test beds is going to need to be very high. Vendors will be testing new products, which competition might want to get a sneak peek of. And there's also the very real possibility that the vehicles being tested on these test beds might not yet have the most robust security in place. So it's important that these potentially insecure vehicles cannot be used as vectors into the rest of the CAV network. I'm now going to move on to talk about some of the threats that F-Secure thinks CAV networks will face and talk you through a couple examples of how these could be actualized. If this is an area of interest to you, I'd recommend reading our full white paper, as it goes into much more detail about the type of assets which will be considered within CAV networks, as well as talking about specific threat actor groups, including APT 32. So here's a rough overview of the threat actors that are likely to target the CAV networks. At the bottom, we've got the most prolific type of hacker, the script kiddie or skiddy. These are just people sat at home, they're just playing around, they downloaded something off the internet, they've got their low orbit ion cannon, they want to have a play with it, they're trying to impress their mates. They are low skill, but they are prolific. And they might target the CAV networks just cause, it seems a bit for the lulz, seems fun. Above this tier, you've got the motivated individuals or hacktivists. These guys actually know what they're doing. They'll quite often be using free tools, or maybe they found some bespoke tools. Maybe they even wrote some stuff on their own. But they tend to be more disgruntled people who are ideologically motivated. So like you get the people who are hacking Sealand, the one in the US, because they were pissed off about the treatment of orcas. It's just people trying to rebel against something that they don't like. Above this tier, you've got the kind of fairly standard criminal groups. They tend to be going for financial gain. This could be just a small group that's created, say, a piece of ATM malware. Like they might just have one techie who creates stuff, and then the rest of the money mules that go around picking up the cash, that sort of thing. They tend to have more cash available than the tiers below, so they can actually buy bespoke tools on the dark market, or fund someone to create tools that are a bit more interesting. Above that tier, you've got serious organized crime groups. These guys have a lot of technical know-how, or at least access to people in the technical know-how. They've also got access to large amounts of resources, so they can kind of do what they want, really. They're going to be able to fund people to research 0 days that are targeting certain technology that they're interested in, all that sort of thing. Above this, you've got the nation-state threats. So these guys, their aim is not always financial, although it can occasionally be. These guys tend to go more for intelligence gathering, industrial espionage, economic destabilization. They tend to be using advanced tools. They might even be stealing tools from governments. They'll be using endless 0 days. Generally, there's not too many of them, but when they target you, you're going to have a bad time. They're very hard to deal with because they have so many resources and technical expertise at their disposal. And again, we think that people at all these levels are likely to target the CAV networks. And frankly, there's no way to keep everyone out. People who have the absolute dedicated skills and resources, they probably will try and figure a way, they probably will be able to find a way in. But it's important to keep these lower tiers out. You shouldn't be able to have a skiddy take down your networks. It's not good. The best way to counter it really is to just have good detection. So even if a nation state was able to do something to your network, by being able to detect it immediately, you can start to go into damage control mode. You can start to ignore data coming from that node because it's malicious, that sort of thing. There's a whole variety of assets that these threat actors are likely to be targeting within the networks for various different, end goals. So you've got the physical ones, which are the obvious things, like you've got vehicles, you've got the roadside units and sensors. But you could also target, say, a garage, so that you could perhaps automatically lift data of everything that comes into the garage, or the back-end servers. If the car is still connected to the vendor's servers in some way, could you pivot from the vehicle into the vendor's servers and do your cyber crimes through there? You've also got the electronic vehicle charging stations. Those are an interesting target. If you could break those, you could cause quite a bit of harm, cause a lot of people to be stranded. You've got your public key infrastructure facilities, like the actual buildings they're stealing them at. If you could get in and steal, the root certificate, you can have some fun with that. On the digital front, you've got sensor data, regional events data, so things like weather. You've got your traffic data. But you've also got personal information probably carried upon these vehicles. Like there's the classic of buying old GPS units and pressing the home button because people have programmed home into them. Or if you steal a car, you just tell the GPS to send you home, and you can get in like that. Within things like testbed results, there's also likely to be financially sensitive information, or even intellectual property. People could actually get any interesting data off of these vehicles, perhaps off the infotainment systems. There might be some proprietary systems that an attacker could gain information about. On top of these assets, you've also got the kind of intrinsic reputational assets. So things like Tesla's been getting hammered a bit in the US news recently because of stuff like people putting autopilot on and then the car driving into a barrier. Or I can't remember which company it was trialing a couple of years back one of their self-driving vehicles that killed a pedestrian. And it's causing reputational harm is a real risk in these areas. You don't want that. So as an example threat, I'm going to talk about Bob the Grumpy Guy. Bob lives in a small village, which has a section of smart roadway running through it. He's upset by the speed at which cars travel through the village, and he wants them to slow down. He's read online that the roadside units placed every 500 meters along the roadside control the speed at which cars drive, so he decides he's going to target them. He goes online and he spends some time learning about hardware security. One night, he takes his laptop and a crowbar to an RSU, which is hidden behind some trees. The RSU is in a locked cabinet, but Bob manages to lever it open with his crowbar. The physical tamper detection system on the RSU detects the unexpected opening of the door and sounds an alarm. An alert is sent to the CAV network requesting investigation. The loud alarm startles Bob and he runs back home. Based on his experience with the roadside unit, Bob decides he's going to try and use other devices to get to the RSU. His neighbor, conveniently, has bought a brand new intelligent vehicle, which connects to these RSUs. Bob does some research on his neighbor's new car, and he discovers that the car broadcasts a hotspot which drivers can connect their phones to. Bob reads a web forum and finds unofficial reports saying the technology used for this hotspot has an abusable authentication vulnerability. As Bob's house is within the hotspot's range, he exploits the vulnerability to connect to the car from his bedroom. Using his knowledge of network security, he's able to pivot through the car's internal networks until he finds the service which allows it to interface with the RSU. After some trial and error, he learns how to send status update messages to the nearby RSU. Bob uses these to send the RSU many reports that the vehicle is covered, that the road is covered in black ice. The RSU collates these reports and does not correctly identify that they have all come from a single vehicle. The RSU updates its models for that area with the presence of black ice and decides that the speed limit in that area should be lowered. The dynamically updated road signs along the village now display half the previous speed limit. Autonomous vehicles automatically adhere to them, and most manually driven cars do. Bob is happy once again. His village is nice and quiet and has slow cars going through it. Next up, we'll talk about an imaginary threat from a malicious nation state. So the country of Zerone spends a lot of time comparing itself to its neighbor, Nerund. Nerund has a highly developed ITS roadway system with many internationally acclaimed CAV developers based in the country. Zerone decides it would like to have more developed ITS roadways too, but it doesn't have the resources to fund the extensive CAV development work Nerund has done. Zerone decides corporate espionage would be a much more cost-effective measure for developing its technical capabilities. Zerone government engages APT32, a Zerone-backed hacking group. This group is tasked with stealing as much information on CAV as possible from companies in Neurand. The APT-77 team decides their first move should be to gain access to the internal networks of Neurand Auto, the country's leading vehicle manufacturer. A spearphishing campaign is launched, and APT-77 soon finds itself with footholds within various support functions of Neurand Auto. APT-77 discovers Neurand Auto does not make use of network segregation. The group can move from an HR employee's computer to one belonging to the tech support team. This tech support team has access to the research and development team networks. Once APT-77 gains access to Neurand Auto's R&D network, they're able to steal large amounts of research work, including plans for unreleased vehicles. The Zeran government is very happy with their information gathered by APT-77. They ask APT-77 to see if their foothold within the Neurand Auto networks can be leveraged to gain access to a given car. The group quickly discovers that through the remote upgrade functionality implemented in all Neurand Auto products, they may push malicious code to arbitrary vehicles. The Zeran government provides APT-32 with details of a Neurand Auto brand vehicle owned by a key Neurand politician. The APT-77 group confirms they can push code to this vehicle. As the code comes from the trusted manufacturer, it is not evaluated. The APT group is able to cause the politician's car to take arbitrary actions. It's not really what you want. So, I mean, these are all proposals at this point. They're not things that are existing in the real world in this state quite yet, thankfully. What can we do at this point? Generally, I think we need a lot more security research within this area. There's still plenty of time to address them. I mean, especially with the UK government's idea of this being the next 10 years. And hopefully the outputs of this project and the other Zenzik projects will help to inform the future decision-making process. So while we were going over all these standard documents, I lost count of the amount of times that I read security is out of scope for this document, or security will occur at another level. You know, people really need to stop doing this. You need to consider the security at every level, in my mind, to make sure that the systems are kind of holistically as secure as possible. I also think that they should take more input from cybersecurity people. I mean, generally, you, dear watcher of this talk, take a look at these technologies yourselves. The 802.11p OCB mode seems to be very under-researched. Like, there's not that much information available on it. But it seems super weird. It seems like there's going to be a lot of potential for abuse, and it seems like you can do a lot of cool stuff with it. Incidentally, if you happen to have access to any tech that actually can is already set up to communicate over 802.11p OCB mode, please do reach out to me on Twitter or email. F-Secure is quite keen to get hands-on with it. We want to collaborate, or just generally chat about 802.11p. It's interesting stuff. I think the testing at scale is going to be a really big problem. These networks are going to be absolutely huge. They're probably going to become part of our critical national infrastructure. And they're going to get popped for sure at some point. But we still need to remove the low-hanging fruit. We don't want the little script kiddies to be able to take bits of the network down. We don't want Bob to be able to mess with speed limits just because he's annoyed by the fast cars. And in the case that something does happen, a breach is detected, we need to be able to address them. So we were proposing a system whereby we can detect the point at which malicious data has entered into the network. So this would be by re-signing your data at every point of transmission. So your vehicle, it signs the data when it sends it on, right? This ends up in the roadside units. The roadside unit collates all this data, and then it signs the bundle of data before it transmits it onwards to the data hub. Then the data hub collates all this information, and then you notice that something's a bit wrong or something's malicious. You can then look at the initial data and say, okay, well, the malicious data include this signed bundle come from the RSUs, that RSU, so it's come from that RSU. And in that RSU, you can work backwards and be like, okay, well, it's been signed by this vehicle. And it's just important to be able to backtrace the point at which the incident has occurred so that you can try and prevent these things from happening again in the future. Like if you notice it's a specific RSU, go investigate that RSU, work out how it got popped so that you can better protect the other nodes within the network. In general, I think that information sharing is going to be really important. There seems to be this thing of cybersecurity being a competitive advantage. It's like considered IP almost, that you know how to not get hacked. And I don't think that should be the case. I think there should be better information sharing between the vendors and even between like research groups. Because if, say you had a phishing campaign targeting your organization as a vendor, it's likely that the attackers will also target similar vendors. So by sharing information between each other, you can be better prepared for these attacks to come in. And if someone does manage to get into your network, you can share that information with other companies so that it doesn't happen to them either. I think we need to get over seeing it as like a competitive advantage and just work more collaboratively in general together. So my conclusions for this are current proposals are not fit for purpose. They're going to be a nightmare of just denial of service and all sorts. Just don't do that. There needs to be more considerations for cybersecurity when designing these systems. Stop passing the buck on cybersecurity or you'll make baby Jesus cry. There's a lot of weird shit in these proposals that people should look at more. 802.11p OCB mode is weird shit. Pseudonyms are even weirder shit. And honestly, I'm never getting a connected or autonomous vehicle if I can help it. Like, I don't even get ones with lane assist. I don't trust it at all. I appreciate I'm in the wrong industry to be saying that, but I don't trust it. So before we finish, I just want to give a few acknowledgements. I'd like to say thanks to my colleagues who contributed to this project. The main contributors were Joel, Rich, and Terry, who all worked heavily on the project. I'd also just like to thank my colleague Kaiten, who, although he's no longer with us, he provided a lot of support to me while I was working on this project. Surrey University also gave us quite a bit of advice on CAV networks while we were doing our research work. I'd also like to thank Zenzik for funding this work and F-Secure for letting me work on it, and KFC for fueling my existence. I was very upset while they were shut in the UK due to the lockdown, but they've reopened now. Everything's wonderful again. So that's the end of my talk. I think we're doing questions in the chat now, or you can tweet me on Twitter. I mainly shitpost, so yeah, but go for it. Or drop me an email. I've got my email address there. So thank you for your time. Thanks for watching, and feel free to ask me any questions.